Everyone laughed when Frank bid his last savings on the empty mine. But Arthur Sterling, the region's tycoon, wasn't laughing. He arrived seconds too late, pale with fear. Frank only understood the rich man's terror when he broke the seal at the entrance. The rocks hadn't fallen naturally. Someone had placed them there to hide something. Frank Miller counted the bills one last time. $350. It was everything he had left in the world after the bank had sent the final foreclosure notice. The auction was in 20 minutes, and everyone in Silver Creek knew he was finished. His hands, calloused from 40 years of ranch work, trembled as he folded the worn bills and stuffed them into his shirt pocket. The town hall was packed. Neighbors who'd stopped returning his calls sat in folding chairs, whispering behind their hands. Arthur Sterling stood in the back corner, arms crossed, wearing a suit that cost more than Frank's truck. The mining magnate hadn't attended a county auction in 15 years, but here he was, watching with the cold precision of a hawk circling wounded prey. The auctioneer, a thin man named Wessler who stammered when nervous, cleared his throat. Next item, Devil's Gulch Mine. 40 acres of mountain property, previously owned by the Henderson estate. Starting bid, $200. Silence. Nobody wanted that cursed land. The mine had been sealed shut since 1983, after what everyone called the collapse. 3 workers had disappeared that night, presumed buried under tons of rock. The place had a reputation, stories of strange lights at night, sounds echoing from deep underground. Kids dared each other to touch the rusted gate, then ran away screaming. Frank raised his hand. His daughter Clara, sitting beside him, grabbed his wrist. "Dad, what are you doing? We need that money for—" $350, Frank said, his voice carrying across the silent room. Laughter erupted. Someone in the back shouted, "Frank's finally lost it." Another voice, "Buying rocks when he can't even feed his cattle." Wessler looked uncomfortable. He glanced toward Sterling, who had straightened suddenly, his face turning the color of ash. The magnate took a step forward, then stopped, his jaw working as if calculating something complex and terrifying. "Going once," Wessler said weakly. "Going twice." $1,000. Sterling's voice cut through the room like a blade. The laughter died instantly. Frank turned to look at the richest man in the county, and something cold slid down his spine. Sterling's eyes weren't on the auctioneer. They were locked on Frank with an intensity that spoke of desperation, not desire. $1,500, Frank said, though he didn't have it. Clara grabbed his arm harder. "Dad, we can't—" Sterling moved forward, his polished shoes clicking on the wooden floor. $5,000. Cash. Right now. The room went completely silent. You could hear the ancient clock on the wall ticking, each second stretching like pulled taffy. Frank looked at Sterling's face and saw something he'd never seen before, on the man who'd foreclosed on half the county. Fear. "Why?" Frank asked quietly. "That's not how auctions work," Sterling said through clenched teeth. "Wessler, take my bid." But the auctioneer was looking at Frank, waiting for an answer to the question that everyone suddenly wanted answered. Why would Arthur Sterling pay $5,000 for property that had been declared worthless for 40 years? Frank thought about the foreclosure notice on his kitchen table. He thought about his late wife's medical bills that had destroyed them. He thought about watching Sterling buy up the neighboring ranches for pennies on the dollar, after mysterious accidents made the land unprofitable. He thought about how Sterling always seemed to know exactly when to strike, when people were most desperate, most vulnerable. $350 is my final bid, Frank said. That's all I've got. Sterling's face went from pale to purple. "You don't understand what you're doing, Miller. That land is dangerous, unstable. The mine could collapse further any day. I'm trying to do you a favor." "Going 3 times, Wessler interrupted, and there was something like respect in his eyes as he looked at Frank. "Sold. Devil's Gulch Mine to Frank Miller for $350. Frank signed the papers with a hand that had stopped trembling. Clara sat beside him, silent and stunned. As they stood to leave, Sterling blocked their path. "I'll give you $10,000. Tomorrow. Just sign it over and forget about it." "Why?" Frank asked again. Sterling's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger, but calculation. Then he smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing Frank had ever seen. "Because I'm a businessman, Miller, And I don't like to see neighbors make stupid decisions. But if you want to keep those rocks, that's your funeral." The choice of words hung in the air like smoke. Frank walked past him, Clara following close behind. Outside, in the harsh Nevada sun, she finally exploded. "What were you thinking? We needed that money for the property taxes, for food, for—" "Did you see his face?" Frank interrupted. "When I bid on that mine, Sterling looked like he'd seen a ghost. So what? He's crazy, everyone knows that. He probably has some scheme to buy up all the old mines for pennies and— Then why offer $5,000 for a pile of rocks?" Frank turned to face his daughter. Clara had her mother's green eyes, sharp and analytical. She'd come home from geology school because there were no jobs. But Frank had always known she was smarter than any of them. "You're the scientist. What would make an old, sealed mine suddenly valuable after 40 years? Clara's expression changed. Her eyes narrowed, and Frank could see her mind working through possibilities. New survey data. Rising mineral prices. A fresh geological study showing something they missed. Or maybe, Frank said quietly, they never missed anything. Maybe they sealed it on purpose. They drove home in silence, but Frank could see Clara's fingers tapping on her knee, that nervous habit she had when solving problems. By the time they reached the ranch house, small, wooden, desperately in need of paint, she'd pulled out her old geology textbook from the back seat. "I'm coming with you tomorrow," she said, "when you go to look at the property." Frank had been planning to go alone, to use his old tractor to haul away rocks for fence repairs, but the tone in Clara's voice told him arguing would be pointless. Besides, if Sterling's reaction meant something, he wanted someone else there to witness whatever they found. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows, thinking about the Henderson family who'd owned the mine before it was sealed. Old Henry Henderson had been his father's friend, a good man who'd worked that mine for 30 years, claiming it was almost tapped out, but always finding just enough silver to keep going. Then came the night of the collapse. 3 workers went in for a late shift and never came out. Henry sealed the mine the next morning, broken and grieving. 6 months later, he died of a heart attack. His children sold the property to the county for back taxes and never returned to Silver Creek. Frank had always wondered why Henry never tried to recover the bodies. A cave-in was tragic, but you didn't just abandon your workers like that, unless— The thought that was forming in Frank's mind was too dark to fully embrace, so he pushed it away and stared at the ceiling until dawn broke across the desert. The Devil's Gulch mine sat at the end of a winding dirt road that hadn't been maintained in decades. Frank's truck bounced over ruts and rocks, Clara bracing herself against the dashboard with one hand, while clutching her geology kit with the other. "This is insane. The whole area could be unstable." "Sterling offered $10,000 for something he thinks is insane?" Frank countered. They rounded the final bend, and the mine appeared before them. Frank had seen it from a distance before, but up close it was even more ominous. The entrance was a massive wound in the mountainside, blocked by a wall of collapsed rock and twisted steel beams. The iron gate hung askew on broken hinges, a faded, "Danger, no trespassing" sign, barely legible beneath 40 years of desert dust. But what caught Frank's attention was something else. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Clara saw them at the same moment. "Someone's been here, recently." Frank parked the truck and grabbed his toolbox from the bed. Clara pulled out her handheld spectrometer and a flashlight, her face set in the determined expression she'd inherited from her mother. "We're just looking," Frank said. "Not going inside. Just looking." The collapsed entrance was exactly as everyone described. Tons of rock and debris forming an impassable barrier. But as Frank examined it more closely, running his hand over the rubble, something felt wrong. "Dad, look at this." Clara was crouched near the base of the collapse, her fingers tracing something in the dirt. "These rocks aren't weathered the same way. See how the outer layer has that oxidized coating, but when you look closer—" She picked up a chunk of stone and showed it to him. The interior was clean, sharp-edged, almost fresh. "This wasn't a natural collapse," she said quietly. "Someone blasted this shut. Recently." Frank's stomach tightened. "How recently?" "Days, maybe a week." Clara stood up, brushing dust from her jeans. "Someone resealed this entrance. But why would—" The sound of an engine made them both freeze. Frank grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her behind the truck as a black SUV crested the hill and pulled to a stop 50 feet away. Arthur Sterling stepped out, flanked by two men in suits who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the desert heat. Sterling's face was flushed, whether from sun or anger, Frank couldn't tell. "You're trespassing on my property," Frank called out, stepping from behind the truck. "Your property," Sterling repeated, and there was no smile now, no pretense of neighborly concern. "You signed papers yesterday. You have no idea what you bought." "Then enlighten me." Sterling walked closer, and Frank could see sweat beading on the older man's forehead despite the cool morning air. "This mine is played out. Worthless. Your grandfather Henderson himself said so before he sealed it." "He wasn't my grandfather, and you're offering 10,000 for worthless rocks?" 20, Sterling said flatly. 20,000, today, right now. Sign it over and walk away." Clara emerged from behind the truck, her spectrometer still in hand. "What are you afraid we'll find, Mr. Sterling?" Sterling's eyes flicked to her, and Frank saw genuine fear flash across the man's face before he controlled it. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, girl. This mine is dangerous. The whole mountain is unstable. People died here." "Yes," Frank said quietly. 3 men. They went in for the night shift and never came out. Strange, isn't it, that Henry sealed the mine the next morning without even trying to recover the bodies? The color drained from Sterling's face completely now. One of the suited men behind him shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving toward his jacket in a way that made Frank's pulse quicken. 30,000, Sterling said, his voice strained. "Final offer. Take it or—" "Or what?" Frank interrupted. "You'll do to me what you did to those workers?" The words hung in the desert air like a thrown knife. Sterling's jaw worked silently, and Frank realized with a mixture of triumph and terror that his wild guess had hit something true and deep. "You have 24 hours, Sterling said finally. "After that, I can't be responsible for what happens. These old mines, accidents occur, collapses, gas leaks. People who go poking around places they shouldn't, they tend to disappear." He turned and walked back to his SUV without another word. The vehicle reversed down the narrow road, sending up plumes of dust that hung in the still air long after the sound of the engine had faded. Clara was trembling. "Dad, that was a threat. That was a direct—" "I know." Frank's mouth was dry. He'd been in bar fights before, had faced down angry bulls and once a cougar that got too close to the cattle. But this was different. This was the cold, calculated menace of a man who had everything to lose and the resources to eliminate obstacles. "We should go to the sheriff," Clara said. "Tell him everything." Frank almost laughed. Sheriff Dawson had been appointed by the county board, a board that Sterling chaired. Every major decision in Silver Creek came down to Sterling's influence and Sterling's money. Going to the sheriff would be like asking the fox to guard the henhouse. "We need evidence," Frank said. "Real evidence. Something so clear that even Sterling can't make it disappear." Clara looked back at the collapsed entrance. "There's only one place we're going to find that." They spent the next 3 hours searching the perimeter of the mine. The main entrance was impassable, tons of rock that would take industrial equipment weeks to clear. But Clara, with her geological training, knew that mines this old often had secondary exits. Ventilation shafts, emergency tunnels, exploratory galleries that branched off the main works. They found it on the north side of the mountain, hidden behind 40 years of desert brush. A small opening, barely 3 feet high, partially concealed by a collapsed wooden frame. "Ventilation shaft," Clara said, shining her flashlight into the darkness. "Looks like it connects to a side gallery, probably 50 feet down." Frank knelt beside the opening, feeling cool air flowing from the depths. The temperature difference was significant, which meant the tunnel system was still intact, still breathing. "I'm going in," he said. "We're going in," Clara corrected. "I have the equipment, and you have the courage to do something incredibly stupid. We make a good team." Despite everything, Frank smiled. His daughter had her mother's fire. They crawled through the narrow shaft, their flashlights cutting weak beams through absolute darkness. The walls were rough-hewn stone, supported by ancient timber that creaked ominously as they passed. Water dripped somewhere ahead, each drop echoing like a countdown. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, the shaft opened into a larger space. Frank emerged first, helping Clara up into what appeared to be a side gallery carved into the mountain. The air here was different, stale, untouched by the outside world for decades. Their flashlight beams revealed rusted mine cart tracks running into the darkness, pickaxes and shovels scattered on the ground as if dropped in a hurry, and something that made Frank's blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dust leading deeper into the mine. "Someone's been here," Clara whispered. "Recently." They followed the footprints, moving slowly, every sense alert. The gallery descended gradually, the ceiling lowering until they had to duck. The walls bore the marks of drilling, but something was strange about them. Clara stopped suddenly, her flashlight fixed on the wall. She pulled out her spectrometer and ran it over the rock surface, then pulled out a small hammer and chipped away at the wall. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking, "this isn't natural rock, it's clay. Painted and textured to look like worthless stone, but underneath—" She chipped away more of the surface, and in the beam of her flashlight, something glittered. "Oh my God," she breathed. "These aren't silver veins. This is— I need to test this. But if I'm right, this is painite. Maybe alexandrite. These are some of the rarest gemstones on Earth. Dad, this wall alone could be worth—" A sound echoed from deeper in the tunnel. Both of them froze. It was a cough. Human. Raspy. Close. Frank motioned for Clara to stay back as he moved forward, his flashlight raised like a weapon. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and there, sitting against the far wall next to an ancient camping lantern, was a man. He was old. Ancient, really, with a long white beard and clothes that looked like they'd been cobbled together from rags and old mining gear. His eyes, though, were sharp and clear as they fixed on Frank. "Took you long enough," the old man said, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "Been waiting 40 years for someone honest to buy this place." Frank's mind reeled. "Who are you?" The old man smiled, revealing gaps where teeth used to be. "Name's James Cooper. Used to be an engineer here back in '83. I'm the one who was supposed to die." James Cooper's story came out in fragments, interrupted by coughing fits and long pauses as he gathered strength. He'd been one of the 3 workers on that final night shift, the ones everyone assumed had died in the collapse. "Henry Henderson called us in special," Cooper explained, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the gallery walls. "Said he'd found something big, wanted us to confirm it before telling anyone. We came down and found exactly what your daughter just found, a fortune in rare stones, hidden behind fake walls that had been here for God knows how long." "Who put up the fake walls?" Clara asked. Cooper's expression darkened. "Henry's father, back in the '30s. Story goes he found these stones but was afraid the government would take everything under some mineral rights law. So he covered them up, kept mining the regular silver veins, and planned to extract the real treasure slowly, secretly, over decades. But something went wrong," Frank said. "Henry got sick, cancer. Needed money fast for treatment, so he decided to go after the stones immediately. That's when Arthur Sterling found out." Cooper spat on the ground. "Sterling owned the processing plant where Henry sold his silver. He had informants everywhere, including one of the workers who couldn't keep his mouth shut after too many beers." Frank felt the pieces clicking into place. Sterling wanted the mine for himself. Wanted it bad enough to kill for it, Cooper confirmed. That night, Sterling's men showed up just as we were documenting the find. They had explosives. The plan was simple. Trap us inside, seal the mine, tell everyone it was a tragic accident. Once the dust settled, Sterling would buy the property cheap from Henry's grieving family. "But you survived," Clara said softly. Cooper nodded. "Barely. I was in this side gallery when the charges went off. The other 2, Tommy Martinez and Dale Preston, they were closer to the main entrance. I heard them screaming as the ceiling came down." His voice broke. "I tried to dig them out with my bare hands, but there was too much rock. Took me 3 days to find this ventilation shaft. By the time I got out, Sterling's men were everywhere, helping with the rescue effort. I knew if they saw me alive, I'd be dead within the hour." "So you disappeared," Frank said. "Been living in the caves up in the mountains ever since. Coming down at night to watch the mine, to make sure Sterling didn't try to reopen it and destroy the evidence of what he'd done. I fixed the ventilation, kept the tunnels from completely collapsing, waited for someone trustworthy to buy the place so I could finally tell the truth." Clara was staring at him with a mixture of horror and sympathy. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Cooper laughed bitterly. "With what proof? My word against Arthur Sterling's? The man who owned half the county and had the sheriff in his pocket? I'd have been committed to an asylum or quietly disappeared. No, I needed evidence. Real evidence. And I needed someone who'd actually fight back. He pulled a metal box from behind him and handed it to Frank. Inside were 2 items, a leather-bound journal and a small canvas bag that clinked when moved. Henry's diary, Cooper explained. He wrote down everything. The discovery, Sterling's threats, the plan to seal the mine with us inside. And in that bag are samples of the stones, with my signed testimony of how I obtained them and when. Everything you need to prove what happened. Frank opened the journal with trembling hands. Henry Henderson's handwriting was shaky, but clear. March 15, 1983. Sterling came to the house again. Offered $20,000 for the mine. Said he knew about the stones. When I refused, he said I was making a mistake. Said accidents happen to stubborn men. I'm afraid. Not for myself, the cancer will take me soon enough, but for my workers. For the truth. If something happens to me, I pray someone finds this journal and knows what really occurred. March 17, 1983. It's tonight. I'm calling Cooper, Martinez, and Preston in for one final documentation of the find. I've decided to seal the mine myself tomorrow, to protect it from Sterling until I can figure out the legal angles. Better to walk away with nothing than let that devil profit from murder. March 18, 1983. God forgive me. Sterling's men came before I could warn the others. I heard the explosions from my house. By the time I got there, it was over. 3 good men dead because of my greed, because I couldn't just walk away. I'll seal this mine forever. Let the stones stay buried with the bodies. Some treasures cost too much. The final entry was written in a barely legible scrawl. April 2, 1983. Dying. Can't breathe. Sterling visited again today. All false sympathy. He knows I know. Promised my family would be taken care of if I kept quiet. I'm a coward. I'm sealing this journal in the mine. If anyone ever finds it, know that Arthur Sterling is a murderer, and I am guilty of letting him get away with it. Frank looked up at Cooper. He didn't know you survived. No one did. And by the time I could have told him, he was already dead. Cooper's eyes were wet. I've lived in those caves for 40 years, watching Sterling grow richer and more powerful. Buying up ranches, forcing out families, all built on the graves of Tommy and Dale. Clara was reading the journal now, her face pale in the lantern light. This is it, Dad. This is everything we need to destroy Sterling. But Frank was thinking ahead, his mind racing through scenarios. Sterling knows we're here. He knows we found the ventilation shaft. Those fresh footprints, someone's been checking to make sure it stays sealed. When we don't show up tomorrow to take his offer, he's going to know we found something. He'll come tonight, Cooper said simply. I've watched him operate for 4 decades. He doesn't leave loose ends. He'll bring his men, seal this ventilation shaft while you're inside. Maybe start a fire in the brush to cover it up. Tragic accident. Foolish rancher and his daughter. Everyone warned them the mine was dangerous. Then we leave now, Clara said urgently. We take this evidence and go straight to... To who? Frank interrupted. The sheriff? The county board? They're all in Sterling's pocket. We step outside with this evidence, and we'll have accidents before we reach town. So what do? Clara's voice cracked. Just wait here to die? Cooper stood up with difficulty, his old joints creaking. No. We do what Sterling doesn't expect. We fight back. They spent the next hours planning. Cooper knew the mine system better than anyone alive. Every tunnel, every gallery, every weak point in the structure. He'd spent 40 years maintaining just enough of it to preserve the evidence while making it look abandoned and dangerous to outsiders. The main entrance is blocked with about 30 tons of rock, Cooper explained, sketching a crude map in the dust with a stick. But behind that blockage is the primary gallery where Tommy and Dale died. Their bodies are still there, preserved in the dry air. If we can expose that area, show the authorities exactly how they died. Sterling will never let us get that far, Frank said. He'll seal us in here first. That's what he thinks he'll do, Cooper smiled grimly. But he doesn't know about the side passages I've dug over the years. There are at least 3 ways out of this mine that aren't on any official map. When his men come to seal us in, they'll be sealing themselves into a trap. Clara was examining her spectrometer readings. Dad, I've been analyzing these samples. If my measurements are correct, there's enough painite and alexandrite in this mountain to be worth. I can't even calculate it. Hundreds of millions, maybe more. Sterling would kill 100 people for this kind of money. He already killed 3, Cooper said quietly. They worked through the afternoon, using Cooper's knowledge and Clara's technical skills to set up what was essentially a siege defense. They positioned lanterns at key junctures to create confusing shadows, loosened support beams that could be dropped to block passages, and most critically, they rigged the old explosives Cooper had been storing. The same kind used to seal the mine 40 years ago. If we do this right, Frank said, studying their preparation, we don't just survive. We expose everything. But we need witnesses, people Sterling can't touch. I've been thinking about that, Clara said. My geology professor, Dr. Chen, she's connected to the U.S. Geological Survey. If I can get a signal out, send her our GPS coordinates, and some of these spectrometer readings, she'll come running with federal authorities. Sterling can own the county, but he doesn't own the federal government. The problem was getting a signal. They were deep in the mountain, surrounded by rock. But Cooper led them to a chimney shaft that ran nearly vertical through the mountain, created by some ancient geological event. Used to be you could see stars through this at night, he said. Might be enough to get a signal if you climb high enough. Clara didn't hesitate. She strapped her phone to her belt and began climbing the narrow shaft, using old pitons and handholds carved into the rock. Frank watched her disappear into the darkness above, his heart in his throat. 20 minutes later, her voice echoed down. Got it. 2 bars. Sending everything now. The message went out. GPS coordinates, photos of the journal pages, spectrometer readings showing the presence of rare gemstones, and a desperate plea for help. Dr. Chen responded within minutes. On it. Federal team mobilizing. ETA 4 hours. Stay hidden. 4 hours. They had to survive for 4 hours. Clara climbed back down, her hands bleeding from the rough rock, but her eyes bright with hope. They're coming! We just have to… The sound of engines outside cut her off. Through the ventilation shaft, they could hear multiple vehicles, men's voices, equipment being unloaded. Sterling had arrived early. Cooper moved to a position where he could see the main entrance through a cunningly concealed observation hole. 10 men, maybe more. They're setting up lights, bringing in welding equipment and concrete. They're not just sealing us in. They're going to entomb this place permanently. Frank felt his chest tighten. 4 hours was suddenly an eternity. They'll start with the ventilation shaft, Cooper continued. It's the only known exit besides the main entrance. Once they seal that, they'll think we're trapped. That's when we move. Move where? Clara asked. Cooper's smile was grim. Deeper. Into the parts of the mine Sterling doesn't know exist. And then we make him come to us. They retreated into the mountain, following Cooper through passages that got progressively narrower and more primitive. The old engineer moved with surprising agility for his age, decades of cave living having kept him lean and flexible. Behind them, they heard the scream of welding torches and the thud of concrete being poured. Sterling's men were working fast, professional and efficient. These weren't local thugs. These were specialists who'd done this kind of work before. How many people has he killed? Clara whispered. Enough that he's got a system for it, Frank replied darkly. They reached what Cooper called the cathedral, a massive natural cavern that the original miners had discovered but never fully explored. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone icicles, and in the center of the chamber, illuminated by their flashlights, was an underground pool of crystal-clear water. The mine connects to an underground river system, Cooper explained. This is how I've survived all these years. Fresh water, cave fish, bats I could trap for meat. Not pleasant, but survivable. But Frank was looking at something else. The far wall of the cavern, where stone gave way to a massive vein of crystalline rock that glittered even in the dim light. That's it, Clara breathed. That's the mother lode. That's what Sterling's really after. The gemstone deposit was staggering in scope, running through the wall like a frozen rainbow. Even Frank, who knew nothing about geology, could tell this was something extraordinary. This wasn't just a fortune. This was the kind of wealth that changed nations, that sparked wars. Henry's father sealed the mine to protect this, Cooper said. Henry sealed it again to protect his workers. and Sterling's about to seal it for the third time to protect his crime. But this time, we're going to make sure the world sees what's really here. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel made them extinguish their lights. Men's voices echoed through the darkness, getting closer. Fan out. Find them. Sterling wants proof they're dead this time. 6 men entered the cathedral chamber, their LED flashlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Frank, Clara, and Cooper were pressed against the wall in a narrow fissure, barely breathing. One of the men swept his light across the underground pool, then up to the ceiling. Jesus, this place is huge. How did the old maps not show this? Because the old man who owned it kept secrets, another voice replied. Frank recognized it. Sterling himself had come into the mine. Cooper knew about these passages. If he's alive, he's down here somewhere, helping the Millers. So Sterling knew, had known for years that Cooper survived. The revelation made Frank's blood boil. Sterling's voice continued. Listen carefully. I don't care about the rancher or his daughter. They're nobody. But I want Cooper alive. He's the last loose end, the only witness who saw what happened that night. Find him, and this all ends. The men spread out through the cavern, their lights crisscrossing in the darkness. Frank counted 6, plus Sterling made 7. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a cave system with only one old engineer and a geologist for backup. But they had 2 advantages: knowledge of the terrain and the absolute conviction that Sterling would kill them no matter what they did. Cooper leaned close and whispered in Frank's ear, "Trust me. Follow my lead." The old engineer suddenly stood up and shouted, "Sterling, it's over. Federal authorities are already on their way." Every flashlight snapped toward them. Frank heard the metallic click of weapons being readied. Sterling's voice cut through the darkness. "Cooper, after all these years, I knew you were too stubborn to die. You murdered Tommy and Dale," Cooper called out, "sealed them in like animals, and you've been building your empire on their graves ever since." "They were going to tell everyone about the stones," Sterling replied, and there was no remorse in his voice, only pragmatism. "They would have cost me everything, just like you're about to cost me everything now unless you do the smart thing. Which is? Come out, all 3 of you. Let's talk like reasonable people." Cooper laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the cavern. "Talk? The way you talked to Henry Henderson before you killed him?" A pause. Then, "Henry died of cancer. Helped along by the arsenic in his medication. I saw the prescription bottles in his house, Sterling. I know your doctor friend who wrote them. Another loose end you thought you'd tied up." Frank glanced at Clara. Her face in the dim reflected light was set and determined. She'd pulled out her phone and was typing rapidly, recording everything. "The federal team is 4 hours out," Cooper continued. "In 4 hours, this whole mountain will be crawling with USGS geologists, FBI agents, and enough media attention that even you can't make it disappear. Your only chance is to leave now, while you still can." "You're bluffing," Sterling said, but his voice wavered. "Am I?" Frank's daughter sent GPS coordinates and evidence to her professor at the university. By now, half the geological community knows about this site. They're coming, Sterling. And when they get here, they're going to find the bodies of Tommy Martinez and Dale Preston, exactly where you left them. They're going to find Henry Henderson's diary. They're going to find this. Cooper gestured to the cavern walls. And they're going to ask why you've been trying so hard to bury it. The silence stretched out like pulled wire. Frank could almost feel Sterling's mind working through scenarios, calculating odds. "You know what I think?" Sterling's voice had changed, become colder. "I think you're right. I think the federal authorities are coming, which means I don't have anything to lose anymore. Either way, I'm finished. But I can make sure you 3 don't live to testify." He raised his voice. "Bring down the charges. We're sealing the main chamber. Everything in it. Let the government find a collapsed mine and 3 more tragic victims of foolish treasure hunting." The men moved quickly, retreating from the cathedral. Frank heard equipment being dragged, the distinctive sound of explosive charges being set. "He's going to blow the entrance," Clara said urgently. "Bury us alive with all the evidence." But Cooper was smiling. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." They ran deeper into the mine, following Cooper through passages that seemed to twist back on themselves. Behind them, they heard the charges being set, men shouting coordinates. Sterling's voice directing the operation with military precision. "Where are we going?" Frank demanded, pulling Clara along by the hand. "The weak point," Cooper replied. "The place where Sterling's greed made him stupid." They emerged into another chamber, this one smaller, but with an obvious difference. One wall was obviously newer, constructed of concrete blocks that didn't match the natural stone around them. "Sterling sealed the original collapse," Cooper explained, pointing to the wall. "He was so focused on hiding the bodies and the evidence that he never thought about what would happen if someone broke through from the other side." "The main entrance," Clara realized. "This is the backside of the collapse. If we break through, we expose everything, the bodies, the fake walls, the gemstone deposits, and most importantly." Cooper moved to a corner where a tarp covered something bulky. He pulled it away, revealing a sealed metal container covered in rust. Sterling's own records. Account books showing every illegal transaction, every bribe, every murder for hire he's ordered over 40 years. He sealed them here because he thought this was the safest place in the world. A tomb nobody would ever open. Frank stared at the container. "How did you—" "I've had 40 years to explore every inch of this mine. Found this 5 years ago. Been waiting for the right moment to use it." The sound of the explosion rocked the entire mountain. Dust and small rocks rained from the ceiling. In the distance, they heard the rumble of tons of stone shifting, passages collapsing. "He did it," Clara said in disbelief. "He actually tried to bury us. And in doing so, he just made his biggest mistake," Cooper said. "The explosion will have weakened this wall, a few well-placed charges of our own, and—" "Wait," Frank interrupted. "If we blow this wall, we're exposing ourselves to Sterling's men. They'll be right there." "No," Cooper smiled. "They'll be retreating. When that first explosion settles, and they realize the whole tunnel system is destabilizing, they'll run for the entrance. Nobody wants to be trapped underground. And that's when the federal team will arrive to find them fleeing a crime scene." It was brilliant and insane in equal measure. But they didn't have many options. Working quickly, Cooper placed the old explosive charges with the precision of a man who'd spent a lifetime around mining equipment. He wired them carefully, running the detonation cord back into the passage where they'd have cover. "When I blow this, we'll have maybe 5 minutes before the mountain decides whether to collapse completely or stabilize. Those 5 minutes we photograph everything, grab the evidence, and get out through the side passage I told you about." "What about Sterling?" Clara asked. "Leave him to me," Frank said quietly. The explosion was smaller than Sterling's, but perfectly placed. The concrete wall shattered, and beyond it, they could see the main gallery of the mine, exactly as it had been sealed 40 years ago. And there, in the beam of their flashlights, were the skeletal remains of Tommy Martinez and Dale Preston, still wearing their mining gear, their tools scattered around them where they'd fallen. Clara immediately began taking photographs with her phone, documenting everything with the trained eye of a scientist. Frank moved to the metal container and hauled it up, grunting with the effort. Cooper stood at the breach, looking at the remains of his friends for the first time in 4 decades. Tears streamed down his weathered face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." "You saved their truth," Frank said. "That's what matters now." They heard shouts from the direction of the main entrance. Sterling's men were indeed retreating, but not all of them. Through the dust and darkness, Frank could see lights moving toward them. Sterling had sent someone to check on the explosion. "Go," Frank told Clara and Cooper. "Take the evidence and get to the surface. I'll handle this." "Dad, no. I said go." His voice was hard, the voice of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be argued with. "This ends now, one way or another." Cooper took Clara's arm and pulled her toward the side passage. She resisted for a moment, then nodded and followed, clutching the metal container. Frank stood in the gallery, surrounded by 40 years of death and secrets, and waited. Arthur Sterling emerged from the darkness, alone. He'd sent his men away. This was personal now. "You should have taken my money," Sterling said. He held a pistol loosely in his right hand, not pointed at Frank, but ready. "You should have walked away. Like you walked away after murdering 3 men? Necessary casualties. They were going to ruin everything I'd built, everything I'd planned. This mine represents the wealth of nations, Frank. Did you see that gemstone vein? That's not just money, that's power. The kind of power that lets you control markets, influence governments, change the world. And all it cost was 3 lives. 3 lives against the potential to reshape the global economy? That's an easy choice. Sterling's voice was calm, rational, as if he were explaining a simple business decision. You're a rancher. You've put down sick cattle to save the herd. This is no different. These were men, not animals. Everyone's an animal when you strip away the pretense. Sterling raised the pistol slightly. Now, where's Cooper? Where's your daughter? I know they took something from here. They're gone. Already at the surface. Already talking to the federal agents who are probably handcuffing your men right now. Sterling's face twitched. You're bluffing. The same way Cooper was bluffing about the federal team? Check your phone, Sterling. See if you can get a signal, because I guarantee you, Clara already sent everything to a dozen different agencies. This mine, those bodies, that evidence, it's over. You lost. For a moment, something like despair crossed Sterling's face. Then it hardened into resolve. If I'm going down, I'm not going alone. He raised the pistol, finger tightening on the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the mine like thunder. But it wasn't Sterling who'd fired. Sheriff Dawson stood in the breach, his service weapon raised, smoking. Sterling looked down at the red stain spreading across his chest in bewilderment, then collapsed to his knees. Did you think I was bought forever? Dawson said quietly, moving into the chamber. Behind him, federal agents in tactical gear flooded through the opening. Did you think there wasn't a line you could cross? More agents poured in, some securing Sterling, others photographing the scene, still others helping Frank to his feet. When had he fallen? He couldn't remember. Shock turning everything into a blur. Clara appeared, running past the agents to throw her arms around him. Dad! I thought he was going to… It's over, Frank said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. It's finally over. They brought Sterling out on a stretcher, still alive but barely. The mine entrance was surrounded by federal vehicles, their lights turning the desert night into artificial day. News helicopters circled overhead like vultures. Cooper stood with a group of FBI agents pointing out locations on a map, his testimony finally being recorded after 40 years of silence. Dr. Chen arrived with a team from the USGS, and Clara immediately began showing them the spectrometer readings, her scientific excitement overriding the trauma of the past hours. Sheriff Dawson approached Frank, looking older than he had that morning. I should have acted years ago. I knew Sterling was dirty. We all knew. But he owned everything, controlled everything. Until tonight, I couldn't prove it. Couldn't touch him without destroying my career and my family. You acted when it counted, Frank said simply. Those men in the mine, Martinez and Preston, they were my deputies back in '83. Young guys, good men who just needed extra money. When they disappeared, Sterling told me it was a tragic accident. Made me help seal the mine. Told me it was too dangerous to try recovering the bodies. Dawson's voice cracked. I've had to live with that lie for 40 years. You just ended it. That's what matters. The full scope of Sterling's operation came out over the following weeks. The account books Cooper had found contained evidence of dozens of crimes, murders made to look like accidents, properties stolen through bankruptcy fraud, bribes to officials throughout the state, even connections to organized crime syndicates that used Sterling's legitimate businesses as fronts. The gemstone deposits were valued at over $400 million, making it one of the largest discoveries of painite and alexandrite in history. As the property owner, Frank was entitled to significant royalties, but he surprised everyone by donating the first $10 million to a fund for the families of Sterling's victims. The remaining money was more than enough. He paid off the ranch, bought back his neighbors' foreclosed properties and sold them back at cost, established a community development fund that couldn't be controlled by any single person, and finally, could breathe without the weight of debt crushing his chest. Clara returned to school, this time fully funded, to complete her geology doctorate. Her research on the mine's formation became a landmark paper in her field. Cooper, for the first time in 40 years, had a proper home. Frank built him a small house on the ranch property, with a room overlooking the mountains where he'd hidden for so long. The old engineer spent his days writing his memoirs and consulting with the mining operation that was eventually established. Properly licensed, environmentally conscious, treating workers with dignity. The bodies of Tommy Martinez and Dale Preston were finally recovered and given proper burials. Their families, who'd never known what truly happened, found closure after 4 decades of questions. Arthur Sterling survived his gunshot wound, but died in prison 8 months later, officially of a heart attack, though rumors persisted that one of his many enemies had finally settled accounts. Frank stood on his porch one evening, 6 months after it all ended, watching the sunset paint the Ruby Mountains gold and purple. Clara was visiting from school, and Cooper was in his house, probably reading or tinkering with some piece of equipment. The mine entrance was sealed again, this time legally and properly, with a memorial plaque for the men who died there. A small operation worked the periphery veins, extracting gemstones at a sustainable rate, providing jobs and tax revenue for the county. But Frank rarely thought about the money anymore, or the stones, or even Sterling. He thought about the choice he'd made at that auction, raising his hand when everyone thought he was crazy, spending his last $350 on a pile of rocks. Sometimes the most valuable things aren't what you find. They're what you refuse to lose. Your dignity, your courage, your conviction that some fights are worth fighting even when the odds are impossible. He'd bought a mine for $350, but what he'd really purchased was justice. And in the end, that was worth more than all the gemstones in the mountain. Clara stepped out onto the porch beside him. Thinking about that day at the auction? Always, Frank admitted. Wondering what would have happened if I'd just let Sterling have it, if I'd taken his money and walked away. Those men would still be forgotten in that mine. Cooper would still be hiding in caves. Sterling would still be destroying families. She leaned against him. You did the right thing, Dad. The hard thing. The only thing, Frank corrected. Once I saw how scared Sterling was, how desperate to keep us away from that mine, there was no other choice. Some things you can't walk away from, no matter the cost. Cooper emerged from his house and made his way slowly across the yard to join them. The 3 of them stood together, watching the desert night settle in, the stars beginning to emerge in a sky so clear it seemed like you could reach up and touch infinity. You know what I realized? Cooper said after a long silence. Sterling spent 40 years protecting his secret, building his empire on lies and murder. But in the end, truth only needed one honest man willing to dig for it. That's all it ever takes. One person who refuses to look away. Frank thought about that, about all the people in Silver Creek who'd known something was wrong, but had stayed silent out of fear or convenience. He thought about Sheriff Dawson, who'd finally found the courage to act, about Clara, who'd used her knowledge to expose the truth, about Cooper, who'd waited 4 decades for justice. Sometimes one person is enough, Frank agreed. If they're in the right place at the right time, and they're stubborn enough not to quit. Clara laughed. You mean crazy enough. Only a crazy person bids their last $350 on a haunted mine. Or smart enough to recognize that when a man like Arthur Sterling gets nervous, there's usually a damn good reason. Frank smiled. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can own is something someone else desperately wants to keep hidden. They stood in comfortable silence as the desert night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The ranch house behind them was warm and welcoming, no longer threatened by foreclosure. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain, but no longer desperate. Frank had gone to that auction expecting to lose everything. Instead, he'd found something worth far more than money. Proof that one ordinary person, armed with nothing but stubbornness and a sense of right and wrong, could take down an empire built on lies. The Devil's Gulch mine was sealed forever now, its secrets exposed, its victims finally at rest. But its legacy would live on in every family that rebuilt their lives with money from the victim fund, every worker who earned a fair wage from the new mining operation, every child in Silver Creek who grew up knowing that justice, however delayed, was possible. Frank Miller had bought a mine for $350. But what he'd really purchased, though he couldn't have known it at the time, was the final chapter in a story of greed, murder, and retribution that had been waiting 40 years to be told. And sometimes, that's all justice needs. Someone willing to buy in, even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. Even when the cost seems too high. Even when the smartest thing would be to walk away. Because the truly valuable things in life aren't measured in dollars and cents. They're measured in the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you everything you have, and the stubborn refusal to let evil win simply because it's powerful. As the stars emerged fully overhead, Frank raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. To Henry Henderson, who tried to protect his workers, to Tommy Martinez and Dale Preston, who deserved better, to James Cooper, who waited decades for vindication, and to everyone who'd ever faced impossible odds and chosen to fight anyway. The mine was sealed. The battle was over. But the story would be told for generations, how one rancher and his last $350 brought down a killer and exposed the truth that powerful men had spent 40 years trying to bury. If you enjoyed this story, remember that justice doesn't always come easy, but it comes to those who refuse to give up. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to bid on a cursed mine, ask the right questions, and follow the truth wherever it leads, even into the darkness beneath the mountain. 3 years later, Clara Miller published her doctoral thesis, Economic Geology and Criminal Enterprise, a case study of the Devil's Gulch Mine. It became required reading in both geology and criminology departments across the country. James Cooper lived to be 96, long enough to see every one of Arthur Sterling's criminal associates brought to justice. He died peacefully in his sleep, in a real bed, in a real house, surrounded by people who knew his name. Frank Miller never remarried. He spent his remaining years as a quiet advocate for small ranchers and mining reform. When he died at 78, his funeral was attended by over 1,000 people, including senators, FBI agents, and families whose lives he'd helped rebuild. The Devil's Gulch Mine Memorial stands today as a reminder that some prices are too high to pay, some secrets too important to keep, and some fights too necessary to avoid, no matter what they cost. And in Silver Creek, Nevada, when children ask their parents about the closed mine on the edge of town, they're told the story of the man who spent his last $350 to buy justice, and proved that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones everyone else thinks are worthless. If you found this story compelling, share it with others. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones about ordinary people who refuse to accept that powerful people can get away with anything. Justice delayed is not justice denied. As long as someone is willing to dig for the truth, no matter how deep it's buried,